We are pleased to have writer, director, and producer Jen Markowitz on Uncultured Twenties with us today. Jen has earned 3 Canadian Screen Awards for writing and producing Canada's Drag Race, which is definitely a guilty pleasure of mine. And they are releasing their first feature documentary, Summer Camp. That's camp with a Q, but not pronounced Qamp, just camp. The film follows teen campers going to an LGBTQ plus summer camp in Alberta, and it's really centered around queer joy and community. Jen, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So you started with scripted television. When I read that you were on Canada's Drag Race, I was like, okay, we have to have this person on here. I need to know more about this process. I know that's not the main topic, but I'm so curious. You were working in and you started working with scripted stuff. Now you're moving into nonfiction and non-scripted content. What inspired you to make that change and create a documentary?
I've actually bounced around quite a bit in my career. I started off in sort of doc TV, reality TV, and then Canada's Drag Race came along and kind of rerouted me a little bit. So to return to doc for this piece was kind of just a very natural move. And of course, what inspired me to take part in this project is the fact that this is the community that I am from. This is a community that I grew up in, and this is a community that I really care about taking care of in terms of, our portrayals on screen as much as I'm able to.
So when you say it's your community, are you talking about Albertans? Are you talking about queer people? Have you attended Camp Firefly?
um, Filming was the first time I've attended Camp Firefly. The communities that I feel mirror my own communities in the film are the queer, non-binary, trans communities, particularly. I
So
did go to summer camp a little bit as a kid, but it wasn't, with the difference between a queer summer camp and a not queer summer camp for a queer kid are pretty massive.
I can imagine. I actually really never went to summer camp, so watching this, I was like, okay, seems like a fun experience, but I really don't think it would have been the same experience.
Yeah.
And so, how did you discover Camp Firefly? I know you said you live in Toronto now. How did
Yeah.
you find this place in Alberta?
Um, we Two of the EPs of the film, Loheimer and Mia Weir are with Hello Friend Media. They're affiliated with, or they are friends with Tegan and Sarah, who are affiliated with this camp. And the group of them kind of got the ball rolling, and they were referred to the camp through Tegan and Sarah being trusted colleagues. Tegan and Sarah had participated in the camp several times. And from there, they kind of brought me on board. And obviously, I was 100% ready to go, wheels hit the ground running when I heard about the project. And that's kind of how they got the ball rolling. From there, Cineflix came on board, and Bright West Entertainment came on board, and we just kind of went full steam ahead. Yeah.
And I noticed there wasn't much talk about it being in Alberta, but I know if Canadians listening know that Alberta is sort of seen as the Texas of Canada. Was that an aspect that you considered talking about in the film, or did that affect, I mean, how did that affect Camp Firefly?
That's a good question. I think I went in with some preconceived notions that ended up being not entirely accurate. I was really pleased to discover that a lot of these kids had a community in their very small town, even if it was just a few people, even if it was just a pride parade of like 10 people marching. I was really pleasantly surprised at how much ground level support there is for queer people in Alberta. But it did, of course, come into play once I started to get to know these kids, and a lot of them came from very traditional Albertan religious conservative households that don't really have exposure to queer communities, don't really understand queer communities. In the best case scenario, that meant their parents really tried to understand them. And in the worst case scenario, that means their parents really didn't think that what was going on for them was real. So it
Yeah,
did come into play. Yeah, it did.
yeah. And so, sort of on that note, what was it like to, how did you navigate working with such young people who maybe necessarily weren't out to their parents. Like there was one camper where we sort of followed their storyline to coming out and how they didn't get the exact reaction that they expected. How did you frame the documentary to their parents and sort of get them to sign off on it?
Well, all the parents knew that this was an LGBTQ plus camp. And so in the case of this one character, Kingston, I had a few Zoom chats with Kingston and his mom, and eventually mom kind of phased out because we were going to talk about what we were going to be doing at camp, and I don't know, like I think by that point mom kind of knew who I was and was okay leaving the room, and it was a tightrope walk with Kingston because I didn't want to blow his house up by I didn't want to blow his cover by confiding by revealing anything he confided to me about, but I also had a responsibility to you know honor his parents' trust in me. So in that particular circumstance, I followed his lead. I kind of went in the direction that he wanted to go, and yeah, and I guess it was a real tightrope walk, but I think it kind of went okay. I think all parties feel okay about it, which is really important to me.
Yeah, that is like, I mean, they're young people trying to find their self, their identity, and break away from their parents, but they're still young and they're still, you know, relying on their parents for support. And I can't imagine what that process must have been like.
Yeah, I think it can be hard for kids who just want the freedom to move around and discover who they are, being asked to identify themselves and label themselves when not all of them are ready to do that. Not all of them will ever want to do that. But that is also a mentality of some people. I also had, Sean in my face, all the old school ways that I still think that could use a little bit of an update.
What were some of those things?
I mean, mostly it was like little slang things that I got made fun of by the kids for.
That's fair. That's fair. Watching the film, it just threw me back to my high school days. I was lucky enough to be in two different high schools where there really were a big queer community in both of them, and just feeling not embarrassment, but just feeling that teen energy to be around where they're so giddy to be around one another, and they have all their little jokes and all their little things, and watching it, I feel like I'm at the age now where I can sort of bask in that awkwardness and bask in that teenage, um that stage where I was like, I can't believe I was like that, but it's also, you have to shake that off because I feel like that's part of the queer experience, is just to be like accepting of the cringe and accepting of, you know, accepting of the hair dyeing and the, you know, everything that you
Yeah.
did when you were younger. And it just makes me so happy to see kids younger and younger being able to find that community and feel free to be themselves. And when they were crying about leaving, I like felt like crying because they just imagining them going back to feeling isolated. It was really hard. Like, do you still keep in touch with some of the campers afterwards?
Yeah. Quite a few. I actually I applied to be a staff member at camp this summer, and I just got back. I was a member of the staff for the season just a couple weeks ago. So yeah,
That's
and there were a number of returning campers, and I met a whole bunch of new ones too.
Oh, that's so awesome. And I'm hoping with films like this, maybe there will be more camps around. Do you know if there's more in the country like this, or how many?
Yeah, there are. There's a network of them across Canada. There's definitely several across the United States too. There are quite a few of them.
What was it like for some of the young queer teens to, because I was reading about the film, how the crew also really got to form a close relationship with the campers. What was it like for the teens to see working queer adults in their space and sort of seeing those role models besides the elders, the rainbow elders in the film?
It was a really nice moment to observe. I think the day we got there, we introduced ourselves and we talked about it during the opening ceremony scene. The crew, like we put cameras down and we talked about who we are, talked about how we our various identities intersect and how our queerness manifests, etc. And so the kids, I think they kind of saw us as a group of adults, maybe some of who were queer. And then once we started talking a little bit more about ourselves, they realized like um, how far in the crew was in their community. And a lot of them really showed a certain level of amazement at the fact that, there were also all their different identities were reflected in the crew. And it was interesting to see the campers pull individual crew members for conversations throughout the week. And also to really see that we, all have families back at home. We're all living really fulfilling and really happy lives as we age. A lot of them hadn't met a queer person older than them. It was nice. And on the receiving end, it was really nice to observe kids in this state that living in a society that's completely different from the one I grew up in terms of acceptance and openness. We kind of bounced off each other and really, I felt like we were kind of healing each other in this nice way too.
Yeah, I remember seeing queer folks like maybe 5, 6 years older than me when I was around that age and just thinking they were the coolest people ever. And I'm still close with a lot of those mentors and I still think they're the coolest people ever. I'm always like, okay, I want to be just like you. I'm just like 5 steps behind.
Nice to have community members to look up to. I think that is, I think a lot of our collective history kind of fell through the cracks because we weren't always congregating and we weren't always open. And so now's a really good time to start laying down our histories so that, people in the future will be able to look back and see kind of where they came from.
And sort of going on that, like the main promo line of your film is centering queer joy in storytelling. Is this sort of making our history concrete part of your mission with the documentary?
Very much. Um, it was hard to grow up at a time where typically any queerness I observed on TV or film was not joyful. It was not very optimistic. And it gave me an impression that I was to grow up a certain way and to become a certain person. And it took me a really long time to shake that off and open myself up to the multitudes of ways that you can live in your queerness as an adult. Um, a lot of that was not having a lot of records to go back to go back and observe, as well as the films that I was watching. And yeah, I mean, I certainly went into this not wanting to inflict any harm on these campers. So queer joy became our mantra from day one. And I'm a little bit of like a bratty party. Like I chant crap at parties and events, and so we just started chanting queer joy all the time, and it became like the last shot of the film is the kids chanting it. So it really, it seems like just a offhanded phrase, but it really is the core of the film and really the heart and soul of where we all came from in making it.
And you mentioned not having a lot of films, the bury your gays trope and not having a lot of films with queer joy. Are there queer films that you take inspiration from as a filmmaker? What are some of the queer films that you consider to be part of your own personal canon?
The queer films that I consider to be part of my own personal canon, they're not typically uplifting. They're amazing films, like Bound and Gregor Raki's filmography, and films from the sort of queer wave of the 90s, where that was sort of the major um subgenre that I raised myself on as a queer viewer. But they're wild films about kids with no parents that want them around, and a lot of death and a lot of sadness and a lot of like really great fashion at the same time. But the stories weren't always super uplifting. But I
Mhm.
think it just instilled in me like the same type of, like indie filmmaking grit sensibility that I tried to bring to this.
If you had one film that you would recommend to our listeners to maybe not compare, but partner summer camp with, what would it be?
Hmm. I think it'd be a great double bill to pair this with But I'm a Cheerleader, which is a film about a conversion camp for gays that obviously does not work for the kids attending it, obviously. And it's also a very stark image of uh, the queer new wave of filmmaking, which which came with a lot of like tenacity and pushback. They really had to fight to create their space compared with this film where these kids just show up, be themselves. It was a dream to make. There was no opposition in terms of any portrayals of queerness. I think it would be a pretty fun double bill.
I think so too. It's one of my all-time favorite films. I do consider it to be a queer classic, and it is the start of that generation of actors. You have Melanie Linsky, you have Clea Duvall,
Yep.
Natasha Lyonne, who I would consider an
Yep.
honorary member of the community. And in the film, when she gets kicked out, she goes to, I think their names are like Roy and Leroy or something. And I feel like
Yes.
that's where Camp Firefly is this like pocket camp where they run away to and they can live
Yeah.
their real selves.
It's funny because all those like campy queer films of the 90s, they really did take the piss out of queer stereotypes. But now, like having gone to camp, I can see that like a lot of those stereotypes are still alive and well in the real world. And they're also like really cherished in the queer community. If there were a couple named Roy and Leroy who wear like applique vests would be held in the highest regard in the queer community in real life as
Yeah.
well.
I think it's also
Nice.
because, growing up and there's so many stereotypes that you don't relate to. And so finally you find a community with stereotypes where you do relate to. It's kind of like, oh, hey, that's me.
Yeah.
Like I see that in myself. Like I don't mind being this stereotype. Like I would love to fit in with, I don't know, being like a chapstick lesbian, whatever terms that people
Yeah.
have, right?
Because it's such a better stereotype to be aligned with than like, you know, the person who's kicked out of their house who's like, whatever, if you're, or
Yeah.
who's like a con artist. Much easier to relate to.
Yeah. Oh, this was a great conversation, Jen. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you for having with me. This was really fun.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I wish you a lot of luck at the festival and I hope it gets the buzz that it deserves.